I think it's a breach of American law, first of all, because tariffs are a tax that are a responsibility of the Congress, not to be voted by one person. We actually once had a revolution because we demanded that there should be no taxation without representation. Well, this was a breach of that. It was a breach of treaties with Canada and the United States. It was a breach of WTO obligations.
How will this approach affect the American economy and that of the wider world? Let's talk to Jeffrey Sachs, a senior UN economic advisor and professor of economics at Columbia University. Good evening to you, Jeffrey.
How are you? Good to be with you.
Very well, and delighted to have you with us. If this trade war, the front lines have been shifting pretty rapidly. What do you make of what's going on here? Those tariffs now suspended when they were due to come into effect against Canada and Mexico.
Well, Trump likes to dominate the news cycle, so we can talk about him morning, noon, and night. In the morning, there are 25% tariffs, and in the evening, there are no tariffs. This is a normal day. What do we make of it? It's not the way that major countries, usually pursue their policies, and but I think this is pretty much par for the course for the coming months and years.
Do you think that both Canada and Mexico are going to be able to negotiate permanent carve-outs from the tariffs? At the moment, the threat has just been suspended for 30 days. Both countries have agreed to bolster their respective borders with the US.
Well, I'd be foolish and not telling the truth if I said that I had any clear idea on that. Remember that we have a free trade area actually with these two countries, with Mexico and Canada, and it was signed by none other than President Donald Trump in his first term. So the whole thing is absurd. The tariffs were signed not because Congress voted these taxes, but because President Trump declared an emergency under special emergency legislation. Well, there is no emergency on the Canadian border. Whether any of this would have stuck in the courts is another interesting question. So what President Trump and Vice President Vance want out of this is perfectly unclear, I have to say. Sometimes Trump talks about the revenues from tariffs. Sometimes he talks about bringing jobs back to the United States. Sometimes he talks about these as threats to crack down on fentanyl. That was today's discussion. Sometimes he talks about tariffs as punishment for countries that don't treat the United States well. And sometimes it's just theater. Today we had theater all day. We had an announcement that was definitive. Tariffs go into effect by the end of the day after moving probably trillions of dollars of wealth in stock markets, mostly downward during the day. There were no tariffs by the end of the day. Who knew? Who knows, by the way, who was betting on all of that as markets were moving one way or another?
Yeah, I mean, Donald.
I don't like this way of behaving. This is actually not a minor country. This is a country that should behave in a different way.
Well, Donald Trump has managed to secure some of what he was looking for. Justin Trudeau has announced this $1.3 billion border plan, including another 10,000 frontline personnel on Canada's border with the US. There are similar arrangements between Mexico and the US. Do you think that Donald Trump will see this as a win? Because in a sense, he gets the bolstering of the border and he doesn't have to go ahead with the tariff plan, which could have been quite damaging for the US economy, couldn't it?
Yeah, he'll call it a win, of course. But maybe it's something that it could have been discussed without any of this tariff threat coming up at all. Who knows? This is just a very unusual way to behave. It's not as if a demand was made or a request was made or a discussion was had, and then as a last resort, this threat was made. The first stage of this was punch the other side in the face and then make a demand. And then when something is done, and we'll see whether these things are really done, then a great win is decided. So there's a lot of theater in this.
And there's
But
more to come, isn't there?
There's a lot of instability in it as well. Let's be honest. This is
and we've seen
very peculiar kind of behavior.
Yeah, and we've seen huge turbulence on the global markets. Donald Trump still threatening tariffs potentially against the European Union. Do you think that tariffs are always damaging for the economy of the country concerned, and when that country is the US more widely?
Well, I think it's interesting that when these tariffs were on in the morning, markets in every part of the world were down. This was not a win for the United States and a lose for the rest of the world. This was a lose-lose proposition. And I think the markets showed that very clearly. The automotive sector in the United States was especially hard hit, with stocks down by 4% because we have an integrated production system of the US, Canada, and Mexico, and it's been that way for decades. And suddenly, one day, one person, one executive order based on a so-called emergency was upending it, at least for the 8 or 10 hours in which these tariffs were supposedly being put in place. So this was an ideal lose-lose proposition.
Well, let me just ask you finally a point that one of our listeners, Marcus, has been raising. He says the US used economic power to blatantly breach international law. That kind of behaviour is not okay or legal. Why not highlight the complete lawlessness? Just briefly, if you can, do you think this was a breach of international law?
I think it's a breach of American law, first of all, because tariffs are a tax that are a responsibility of the Congress, not to be voted by one person. We actually once had a revolution because we demanded that there should be no taxation without representation. Well, this was a breach of that. It was a breach of treaties with Canada and the United States. It was a breach of WTO obligations. So all in all, it's absolutely not the way that a country should behave in a system which has enough instability intrinsically. We don't have to add to the instability of the world in this way.
Great to speak to you. Jeffrey Sachs, Senior UN Economic Advisor and Professor of Economics at Columbia University. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Let's talk to Sir Adam Thompson, former Director of the European Leadership Network and UK Ambassador to NATO between 2014 and 16. Good evening, Sir Adam.
Good evening, Carol.
Very good to have you with us. Lots happening just in the last half hour. First of all, the Prime Minister there in Brussels having dinner with EU leaders. He's trying to reset relations with the EU, just as Donald Trump is threatening the EU with trade tariffs. How do you think this is going to go?
Well, they will certainly have been discussing the trade tariffs as well as harder defense issues. And it is a little delicate for Keir Starmer because the UK has a surplus. The United States has a surplus with the UK. So it's less in Donald Trump's sights for tariffs if what Donald Trump wants is not to run a deficit with other countries. What Keir Starmer has said in public is what any British Prime Minister should be saying in public. He should not be choosing between the United States and the European Union unless he absolutely has to. In private, I think he will be expressing very much the same feelings of alarm that EU leaders are feeling about Donald Trump's tariffs, and he will be looking to be as constructive as possible on defense. I think he's hoping that that will include tackling illegal migration and organized crime and data sharing for better security, and not just hard defense. But Ukraine was looming over this dinner, and it's still a major issue for both the UK and the European Union. And they are still working on answers to the challenge of supporting Ukraine if the US is not going to be there for Europe.
Yeah, and I'll talk a bit more about the defence issue and Ukraine in a moment. But the Times in the morning, the headline PM won't back EU in trade war. As you mentioned there, in public, Keir Starmer is saying, look, I don't have to choose. But if Donald Trump does carry out his threat to impose tariffs on the European Union, it's going to be very difficult indeed, isn't it, for him to sit on the fence?
It will, and I think we've already heard from British ministers, and we'll hear much more of how, just as Ursula von der Leyen was saying in the clip you played, that a trade war between close allies does nobody any good except for those in Moscow and Beijing.
And we've heard tonight from Justin Trudeau in Canada that the threat of tariffs on Canadian goods, or in fact, some of them had already been imposed, Canadian goods going into the US, that's now been suspended for 30 days after they've agreed to work together on things like illegal immigration. And this follows the suspension of the tariffs that were due to be imposed on Mexico after it agreed to send 10,000 troops to the border. Do you think that there could be a negotiation that the EU, just as Mexico and Canada have done, could find ways of avoiding a trade war with the US?
Well, Donald Trump is famously unpredictable, so it's pretty hard to be sure. But the moves he's just made with Mexico and Canada do make it look as though his decisions on tariffs have been more tactical rather than strategic, negotiating moves rather than a settled determination. It leads Canada and Mexico on the one hand and the United States on the other into what are likely to be quite protracted and ugly negotiations with Trump periodically threatening the imposition of tariffs. And I guess that's what the EU should be expecting right now. We had tariffs on Europe in the first Trump administration. Trump used economic coercion to torpedo the Iran nuclear deal, something much more important for Europe than for the United States. And I guess we're going to see a continuation of that kind of approach of constant threatening, constant flattering of the ego by Starmer and other European leaders, and an ugly and rather public negotiation as a result.
And do you think that the UK would be able to plead a special case, avoid tariffs by essentially sitting on the sidelines and letting the EU and the US get on with it?
I think it might get a different approach from Trump than his one towards the EU. I'm no great Trump expert, but it looks to me like he needs to extract and be seen to extract his pound of flesh from every single partner. So I don't expect the UK to get off scot-free. And there are a couple of deeper points here. And one is that if there were a trade war between the EU and the United States, this would be extraordinarily bad for the UK economically, because these are our largest trading and investment partners, but also geopolitically, and because I think it signals the inevitability of a transactional Trump approach towards NATO, which is not good, and much more fundamentally, it signals a completely different United States approach to Euro-Atlantic security, a transactional one where the United States is less concerned about whether borders are violated and territory annexed than Europeans historically have been. So it's something of a watershed in the history of the West as a concept.
And is, under those circumstances, is the UK right to be seeking this new security alliance with the European Union? He's talking about this whole new security partnership, which he says will bolster NATO. But can that work as part of NATO, or is there a risk that just further frays the important bedrock of the alliance?
I think it totally can work. I'm very positive about that. There was a time when the NATO-EU relationship was zero-sum, but both institutions have come to understand over the last decade or so that they are indispensable to each other. They each need something from the other that they don't have themselves. So strengthening the UK-EU relationship and making Europe as a result, better able to look after its own security is actually the vital contribution to transatlantic relations that we now need.
Sir Adam Thompson, former director of the European Leadership Network and UK ambassador to NATO. So good to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Helen's got in touch. Good to know you're enjoying the show, Helen. She questions whether Canada, as a member of the Commonwealth with King Charles as sovereign, does this mean President Trump is constitutionally ineligible to be invited for a state visit by the monarch? Because anyone who tries to illegally annex and intimidate a Commonwealth member state with tariffs into becoming a 51st state of the United States is breaking the Realm Framework Agreement or worse. Helen, you're obviously better informed about Commonwealth and royal law than I am, but good to hear your thoughts. Do keep them coming into us